everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm Asha, live in Palo Alto. Most of you I know or have met at least on occasion. I wanted a play date with Nirmala and Dharmadas, so we traded. I say this is the toll for the play date I've had with them, which has been a pure joy. Friendship is very important on the spiritual path. We have to give it enough energy. So anyway, I was, ego, friend or foe is a gigantic topic, so I'm going to just randomly pick it up from one piece and hope that it's helpful, something I say. For a number of years, starting in 1987, I was part of a foursome that led pilgrimage tours to India for Ananda. This was before Swami had moved there, before we had to work there. We were just, very few people in our community had ever been to India at that time. So it was a whole gigantic adventure that we followed out, and we did it about 12 times over 20 years. And one of the later trips that we took by then, Swami Kriyananda was living in Delhi, and we went up to Rishikesh, and our Indian guide Mahavir was a great fan of finding saints and sadhus, and we were not at Rishikesh, we went up to Badrinath, which is higher still in the mountains, this big temple. Many of you have probably been there by now. I mean, many trips have been taken. This Badrinath temple, it's dedicated to Babaji. It's about 10,000 feet up in the mountains. It's wonderful. But that's beside the point. I'm not leading trips anymore, so I'm not selling it. But you can go with other people, and I highly recommend it. But the altitude is significant. But Mahavir took us a couple of thousand feet higher up to meet a sadhu who was known as Bakswala Baba. And we were meeting him for the first time. The Italian group had met him the year before, and Bakswala Baba was there, and he lived in this little kutir that was probably approximately the size of this dais, up in this little sort of neighborhood of kutirs where other sadhus lived. There's everything has its esoteric, so there's this whole little neighborhood of sadhus, and they all know each other. And when they're home and receiving visitors, they put a flag up so that pilgrims can come and have darshan. And I'd never been any place like this before in this lifetime, but the samskars are deep. And I was sitting there in this little kutir, and through the doorway you could just see the Himalaya, the mountains. We couldn't see the snow-covered peaks, but just the mountains right in front of us. And he lived in the simplest possible way in this little place. He happened to be in silence, so he would write on a slate in Hindi, and then Mahavir would translate into English. And he was called Bakswala because when the winter time, when the snow comes there, it's so deep for so long, the whole temple closes. And they move it down to 7,000 feet, and they just take everything down to 7,000 feet. Everything is buried in snow, and then after it melts, they come back up again. And so all of the sadhus vacate. They go down to a lower height, except Bakswala Baba. He goes into this large metal box, and here is the box, he shows us. And he sits in the box, he goes into a state of cosmic consciousness, and then he goes to the higher mountains and spends the winter with Babaji. And he goes into the metal box so that the animals won't eat his body. Yeah, and practical. And he just tells us this whole story via the slate, but Mahavir is telling us the whole story. And it's reputed to be true. I mean, the American skepticism is always hard to shake, no matter where you are. But it's reputed to be true because he doesn't go anywhere. And he's not dead in the spring, so something happens. But I was so overtaken by everything. I couldn't tell what was coming from him, what was coming from the kutir, I didn't know. So later on, I'm back in Delhi and talking to Swami, and Swamiji asked me, "What did you think about him?" And I explained to him, how could I tell? I said, but what struck me, and this was like American skepticism, finding something to hold on to. I said, he spoke so casually about just going into the box and then going to be with Babaji through the winter. And Swami's answer, it was vivid. He said, well, at a certain point, it's just natural. And I thought, well, that's absolutely true, isn't it? At a certain point, it's natural. It's nothing to exclaim about. It's just, I'm just doing the things that I do because they are the most delightful and wonderful things for me to do. So I live in this tiny kutir, and during the winter I put my body in the box and I go to Babaji, and why would I make a big deal about it? Well, sometime later, I don't know what would have been years later, a few years later, I myself was traveling around India giving satsangs. We had groups here and there at that time. And I was in Bangalore, and I was giving a satsang to the Bangalore group there. And they asked me, because we didn't know each other well, they asked me, how did I meet Swami Kriyananda? How did I come to Ananda? So I told the story, which many of you know. But it was 1969, I was 22, it was the end, just the very end of the year, Thanksgiving, the week just before Thanksgiving. Swami Kriyananda was giving a talk, had been invited to give a talk at a fraternity house on the Stanford campus. The fraternity house, it was a party fraternity. How they ever and why they ever invited Kriyananda, I have no idea, but thank you, God. And friends of mine, Lakshmi, who still lives at Ananda Village, she had met Swamiji, and she had told me, her exact words were, "I've met a real teacher, and I think you'll like him." Truer words, never spoken. So I went to hear him speak, and literally, he walked in the room. I just knew that I'd found what I was looking for. He had the consciousness that I understood enough about spirituality at that point that I knew what I wanted was a state of consciousness. I had no idea how to get there. And I saw it walk into the room. And this was just the grace of God. He didn't even speak, he just walked in. And he had no boundaries. That's how I described it. He just had no edges. And I'd never seen anything like it. And thank you, God, I knew what I was looking at. It took me a little more than a year before I was able to extricate myself from various karmic things that had a hold of me. And I moved to Ananda Village just before I was 24, June 1st, 1971. And I never ever looked back. This is the story I told, somewhat less hurriedly, but because the story's not the point. And then they all sort of looked at me like this, and they said, "What did your parents think?" And I kind of looked back at them and said, "I never asked them." And then I said, "I'm an American, remember?" But I also, it was like, why would I have asked my parents? Why would I have asked anyone? I knew exactly what I was doing. I had been waiting my whole life for it. My tremendous fear in life was that I would never find the exit door. My fear was that I would just do what everyone else around me was doing because I'd never find an option. I mean, quiet desperation. So when Swami came in the door, there was no oh, maybe yes, maybe no. It was like I'd been rescued, and I got there as fast as I could get there, and I never looked back. Not for 2 seconds have I ever looked back. So I see these people, sort of like, wow. And I saw me sitting with Vaxwala Baba going, wow. And I could see how we all just move with whatever we're supposed to move with. Now I'll give you the last. This is a trio of stories that I've thought about a lot. Swami Kriyananda used to come and stay in our community in Palo Alto on sort of a regular basis. For a while his parents lived close by. Well, actually not, his parents had died by the time we moved there. But we had the international airport, we were close to Carmel, we were well situated for him to come and visit. So he often came and visit, and he also did it, of course, to give satsang and so on. And we were running at that time, I don't know if you're still running it now, but we had 2 kinds of satsang groups. One was sevakas and one was sadhakas. And it's a quiz that we actually even still ask colony leaders to this day. For extra bonus points, what is the difference between the sevaka and the sadhaka order? I've been going to colony leader meetings for almost 30 years, And every 3 or 4 years, in the colony leader meeting, they'll say, what is the difference between the Sevaka and the Sadhaka order? The difference, I'll tell you. Save it for extra bonus points. It's subtle, but it's true. Sevakas are those who have no limiting karmic conditions and therefore can give their entire life to Ananda because nothing else, they're responsible for nothing else. Sevakas may be equally dedicated to God, but may have karmic conditions, children, financial, spouses, responsibility to parents, who knows. There's certain karmic conditions that make it mean they have to always have other considerations. They can't just take orders, pick up and move. And it's there it is. So within Ananda generally, and in our community, because we were there a long time and had a lot of population running through, we had a very vibrant Sevaka group and a very vibrant Sadhaka group, but sometimes there would be a little, why am I not a Sevaka? What is the difference? This sort of thing. So Swami was there. And we had 2 satsangs, one for the Sevakas, one for the Sadhakas, and we're having the Sadhaka meeting. And knowing that sometimes they have a little more trouble with their self-definition than the Sevakas, he said, as we're walking over to where the satsang was, what should I talk about? I said, Swamiji, why don't you talk about what it means to be a sadhaka? He said, okay. You know how he is. He would just walk in the aisle and say, what's my topic? He's just very casual about it. Or stand here and say, what's my topic? Right, like that. So he sat down and he began to talk. And he was in a mood and he was reminiscing, but with really from his heart, sort of talking about his life. And he talked, as he often did, about the period of time when he had been in India and then Dayamata and Taramata summoned him to New York and they expelled him from SRF, and he suddenly found himself at the age of 36, having been a monk for 14 years, having given his life completely to that. He was alone in New York City, forbidden to contact anyone that he knew, forbidden to be associated with SRF ever again. He had, I think, $500 in his pocket. There he was, like this. Fortunately, his parents had just come back from Europe, were in New York. He got in their car, they drove across the country, and he went to live with his parents in Atherton, which is right near Palo Alto. So he's living in the spare room of their house, and it was, as he's written, and as all of you know, it was an extremely intense period of divine testing. Who am I? What is my life about? How do I live for my guru now that the entire context of living for my guru has been taken away from me? And then slowly by slowly, he found a way, God pushed him back into public life, and he begins to teach, and a little bit he gets associated with Haridas Chaudhry, who had a center, had because he's passed, but the center's still there in San Francisco. Swami began to teach there. He was also going sometimes to the New Kamal Lilies monastery in Carmel. He was beginning to teach. His parents are supporting him by letting him live there, and his father's also giving him a car to use. And after a period of time, his father generously says to him, you're using this car all the time. He said, I would like to just give it to you. And Swamiji says, when he's telling us this story, it was perfectly appropriate offer on my parents' part. It would have been churlish of me to refuse, their generosity. He said, and I needed a car with the life I was living. Then Swami's sitting there, and tears begin to roll down his face. He says, I was a monk. I had given my whole life to God. I can't tell you how painful it was for me to think I was going to have to now own a car. Yeah. And then he sort of mastered himself and went on with the story, whatever it was. And not too long after the satsang was over, or that he sort of ended, and he turns to me and he said, well, Asha, is there anything else I could talk about? I said naively, well, you could talk about what it means to be a sadhaka. Some moments you're prouder of than others. But he looked at me so seriously like this, and then he looked at the group. He said, That's all I have been talking about. And then he said, don't even think about trying to live the way I live. He said, you wouldn't be able to do it, and it wouldn't be right for you even to try. Wow, like that. And I've thought a lot about it. I mean, I thought about it then. The incident in Bangalore happened later, in fact. But one day, just like all three things just came together in my consciousness. And I realized that our spiritual life, it simply cannot be forced from the outside. And the ego is a friend and a foe in this. I mean, the ego is what makes us conscious enough to know that I am suffering and that it's possible for me to figure out what causes it. This is what distinguishes us from dogs and cats and monkeys and horses and all of the other creatures, whales and dolphins. No matter how sentimentally and sometimes appropriately we may think that they are more refined than many humans we know. Their problem is they cannot reflect objectively on their experience. You know, they can't think, oh, some of my litter mates went to better homes than I did. You know, they got really real leather toys and I just get this cheap plastic stuff. You know, they just don't have the capacity to do it. They can't think about it. There's a story by P.G. Wodehouse called The Shy Man. And it's about this dog. It's from the point of view of the dog. And the dog is so devoted to his master, but he notices that his master just is really shy. He just doesn't know how to relate to people. Like, people come and knock on the front door and he hides and things like that. So the dog helps him. Turns out his owner is a burglar, and the people knocking on the door are the police trying to get him. But animals, dogs, can't reflect objectively on their experience, and they can't think, I could make it better if. And that's where ego, it's not helpful to think of ego as an enemy, because without it, we wouldn't be able to reflect and know what to do. We wouldn't be able to make conscious decisions and direct our energy. But what also happens with our ego is that we also want to be thought well of by others. We want to be thought well of by ourselves. We define ourselves by this little individual unit of consciousness that we're carrying around, and we compare it to others, and we want to polish it up and make it look a little better. And we either want to look good to ourselves, because it's not so easy to know who we really are. It's not so easy to be at peace with who we really are. And so we try to think about what it should be like. Now, having been with Ananda now as long as I have, it's, there's, everything is a mixed bag always. In the very early years of Ananda, it's very hard to comprehend now, there was actually a lot of almost controversy about Swamiji's leadership. There were a lot of really rebellious types there, and at the very beginning, as Swami said, you can't start a community without having somebody in it. So people had to be allowed in. And in the very beginning, it was very undefined, and a lot of the people who came in did not really have the right vibrations. I mean, some learned the right vibration without casting any aspersions on her, because Shavani tells these stories about herself. She says she got in just before the standards were raised. And fortunately, she was able to come up with them. I remember when Haridas first came, my friend Lakshmi, who has a very refined sense of how things ought to be done. Haridas was 18, and he sat down he plopped down next to Swami, is how the story was told, and he kind of leaned across the table and just announced, "I like it here, I think I'll stay." And Lakshmi just was, he was just this hippie kid who'd just come up from Southern California. She was like this. And Swami looked at him so seriously and said, "I think that would be wonderful." So many we didn't know, but Swami knew. But others really, they didn't belong, and eventually they left, and they didn't want to be told what to do, and Swamiji said it was so aggravating because they had this idea that we shouldn't be materialistic, and materialistic meant to work, or to or to try to pay the bills or anything like that, because God will provide. So they would do whatever they felt God wanted them to do, which included spending the long days at the river and just whatever they wanted to do, while Swami worked and paid the mortgage, so then they could say, see, God provided. But as a consequence of the chaos, the joyful chaos, if you began to understand who Swami was and what he had to give us, you found it from here. You found it because you felt it in your own consciousness. You felt his consciousness in your consciousness. And of course that made that connection. Nothing could touch that. Didn't matter what anybody said, because it wasn't based on anything outside yourself. And of course, gradually over time, critical mass develops. And of course, it was much more pleasant for Swamiji when people started supporting him collectively instead of fighting him. But there was also a little something lost, because now people would look to see how others responded, or they would know how they were supposed to feel. And of course, somebody may offer to you the idea that you might feel this way, and then in fact it's confirmed in your own experience. But there's always that fine line where you're doing what you think you should be doing rather than who you really are. And the art of the spiritual path is to grow like an apple tree. It's the miracle of life all around us is so extraordinary. I have these few fruit trees out around where I'm living now, and I have this little fig tree that is just producing figs. Like, there's this huge fig tree that's about as big as a big truck, which is a very short distance away. And so I go out to the little one a lot, and I don't know whether he's intimidated by the big guy or inspired, but he's doing a great job. But I'm watching them grow, these little trees, because I planted a few of them, not from that small, but just watching them grow. And there's absolutely no way that little fig tree is going to get to be a big fig tree, except by letting that power within him gradually come out piece by piece, and his true nature will then express. And for all of us, because of that ego awareness of where our misery comes from, and our deep desire to skip the middle part, which is to actually learn the lessons and balance the karmic scales. But there's no way. We have to do that which is natural to us, whether it's extreme or simple. Swami says, don't even think about trying to live the way I do. It wouldn't even be good for you to try. That was the interesting line there, isn't it? Because it wouldn't be coming. It wouldn't be your natural next step. And on the spiritual path, that's what we're always looking for. We're always looking for, Haridas, who has been the author of a marvelous number of wonderful phrases, he says you have to always pay attention to the joy barometer. That's what he called it. Is the joy barometer rising or falling? And when Swami was asked once, how much discipline is enough discipline? He said, that which you can enter into joyously. Now you must understand, joy and pleasure are not the same thing. Joy is a quality of the soul. Joy is Ananda. In English, the words are not clear, but Ananda is what we're talking about, which is the bliss that comes from spiritual attunement. Because much of discipline is not at all pleasant. But pleasure is not the point. The point is joy. And when we do it because we understand for ourselves why we're doing it, then there's no deprivation there. And yes, we should push then. We should push it to the end point that we can do with joy. And that's where our self-awareness and our understanding and our sincere self-honesty, that's where our power comes from. That's where it always has come from and always will come from. The single most important thing on the spiritual path is to be unafraid before God, to be who you are. And it's not so easy. And it's not merely because we want to look good. It's because that we have so many past experiences that we're always carrying. It's amazing to me how current every unresolved emotional issue is, no matter how old it is. I mean, even lifetimes, you know? And that's what it is that we're unraveling. That's the heart. The heart is always protected. Swami Kriyananda had the most brilliant mind I've ever encountered by leagues. And I'm fond of intelligence, so I always appreciated that and studied that in him. And I wanted to be an intelligent person. It was a value I was raised with. And he was so much more intelligent than I could ever imagine. I wanted to know why. And one day I observed it in his posture. Those of you who only knew him as an old man, he'd sort of shrunken in like this a little. But when he was young, he was the strong bow of the Mahabharata. Straight spine and slightly arched chest like this. And when you looked at him from the side, his chest was always a little more forward than any other part of him, his heart. If you think of it as moving into the world and meeting the world, he always met the world like this. You know, I and other people of a more cerebral bent tended to push like this. You know, you're just sort of meeting it like that, and not with the spiritual eye. But Swami always, he was completely at rest, and then he would just put that heart forward, and he was absolutely unafraid. Reason follows feeling, Master said. The heart is prejudiced, the mind finds reasons to support it. And then your capacity to perceive reality is limited by your heart's need to protect itself and to make the mind obey. Swami was fearless. Truth was his God, so to speak. Truth was what he had devoted himself to. It's what he was searching for all his life until he met Master, and then he understood it more clearly. But that's all. What does it matter? And you see, for other people that's afraid. For him, he was perfectly natural in that. He could speak of it so casually. What is the point? Oh, I can think of lots of points, sir. You know, what if? Well, why not? And there we are. That's the spiritual path. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the courageous in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are those who seek, because in the end they will find. God promises it. The little fig tree becomes a big fig tree, and much to its own surprise produces luscious fruit. Us too. God promises. God bless you.